Hey there, rednecks, preppies, redneck preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great. Good. So about 8 months ago, I reported on a story which involved an explosion at a Seffner, Florida home. Short version of events was that an explosion took place, essentially leveling a home, which authorities then attributed to a man in that residence reloading ammunition. Now, if you watched my video, and there is a link in the description as well as one at the top corner, you may remember that I raised an eyebrow at the conclusion that reloading had caused the explosion. I based my arguments on some assumptions that I thought were reasonable. Was I right, though? Well, in an effort to find out, I recently contacted Hillsborough County authorities to obtain the final reports concerning the explosion. Something that I don't believe anyone else has done, as I haven't seen any news stories or videos following up. Now, I'm going to say for the record that I am not an expert on explosives and explosions in general, despite having caused a few, but, no comment. So I'm prepared to be completely wrong in my thoughts on the conclusions of the reports. Also, I know some keyboard warriors are going to mash away and accuse me of doxing the homeowners by not hiding their last name and address in these reports. I could go through the effort of blacking out dozens of references to those pieces of information, and then you could just send a single email and obtain the reports yourself. Also, you can find out the address just by reading the news reports and then do a simple search for the name of the homeowners themselves. I'll say this just once. All of this information is publicly available. You can get it just as easily as I could. There is no doxing in this video. Now, in the description below, I have links to both the laboratory and ATF reports. Feel free to download the documents for yourselves and decide on whether I'm out to lunch with my conclusions. All that out of the way, let's get into this. Now, as part of my request, I received 3 documents from Hillsborough County. The first is basically an incident report, which documents what EMT, fire, and police personnel were dispatched to the scene and when. I'm not going to go over this because it doesn't add anything to this video. The second report are the lab results and what was tested for. It's a basic report and it won't take long to go over. Finally, we have the ATF report, which has the meat and potatoes. I'll be spending a bit of time on this one, as it's the one that has the most interesting information. Now, let's start with the lab results report. As you can see here, a total of 3 samples were tested. Insulation from the floor and a swab of the workbench where the reloading took place were tested, as well as a control sample was sent. Each of the 3 samples were tested for the presence of ignitable fluids and, at least according to the laboratory report, explosives or incendiaries. Now, as you can see from this page, the control sample was clean, as one would hope. There was also no ignitable liquid on the workbench. The insulation from the carpet did have some petroleum distillate, but they all do because that's what it's kind of manufactured from. Now, the lab test, as you saw from the other page, also requested explosives and incendiaries, but this lab report doesn't mention anything about them. I'm not sure why, although the fact that the report is called Forensic Fire Debris / Ignitable Liquid Laboratory Report may explain that. At any rate, there's nothing more to this report other than the signatures of the various people involved in collecting and analyzing the samples. Now on to the main event. This is a 15-page report, and I'm going to go through several items on it. I apologize ahead of time, but I wanted to present all of the information that I think is relevant. I understand if you get bored and nope out of the video, but this is going to be a bit of a deep dive. I'm going to give away part of the ending right at the beginning. As you can see on the synopsis section on page 2, the ATF deemed the explosion to be an accident. You'll see why soon enough. Moving on to page 3, there's some interesting information here. The homeowner had been to the range that morning and started cleaning his firearms while the other person in the home, his wife, was watching television. After the explosion, his wife told first responders that the explosion had to do with gunpowder and the reloading of ammunition. She also stated that her husband had had 18 years' experience reloading. When questioned, the husband also told investigators the same thing and underlined that he hadn't been making an explosive device, something that obviously the ATF would be very interested in. He stated that he was reloading .223 Remington ammunition and that one of the primers became stuck in his Dillon progressive reloading press. He believed that the primer then detonated and caused a chain reaction with a nearby 1 pound can of gunpowder that was located about 6 inches away from his press. The husband also stated that he had 6 pounds of gunpowder in a nearby gun cabinet as well as 1,000 primers. Interestingly, ATF also noted that the husband was a smoker and that, quote, smoking materials, presumably cigarettes and a lighter, were in the same room as where he was reloading. Now, over on the next page, investigators noted that there was little fire damage, and the damage was primarily explosion-related, including sending his garage door flying across the street into a neighbor's lawn. Finally, the home was made of cement block. I'm not an expert, but in my recent trip to Florida, I noticed that a lot of homes are constructed in a similar fashion there. Now, over on page 5, investigators began detailing the damage to the home, and it was quite extensive, as the pictures document. On the south side of the home, the roof fell in, and windows were all blown out, and the concrete block walls were actually moved. It's on this side of the home that the garage door became a projectile. Page 6 states that the west side of the house sustained the most damage, as you can see from the picture, much of the wall falling over from the blast. That indicated, obviously, that the explosion came from within the home. Finally, on page 7, investigators reported that relatively little damage was seen on the north and east side of the home. On page 8, investigators state that due to the damage and other factors, the spare bedroom, where the reloading took place, was considered ground zero for the blast. Now, here is where we start getting more meat for this story. On the back patio, investigators state that they found 6 empty 1-pound cans of smokeless gunpowder, which they surmised had been repackaged into another container before being brought into the room where the reloading took place. Here's a picture of those containers. Investigators also noted on page 9 that they could smell burned gunpowder that was present throughout the scene of the blast. They also found the Dillon press, which was in remarkably good condition, despite being only a few feet away from the explosion, which I suppose Dillon could use in their ad materials promoting the durability of their presses. On the next page, investigators inventoried what they found during their, air quote, excavation, as they put it, which included an AR-15 style rifle, presumably an AR-15, ammo cans, and the gun cabinet mentioned earlier. The cabinet had apparently been bolted down to the floor at one point, and the door was found about 10 feet away after the explosion. The language in the report is a little unclear, but I believe that the cabinet door was open at the time of the explosion. As mentioned earlier, they did find the remains of previously smoked cigarettes and a lighter in the room. Now, not surprisingly, investigators determined that the explosion took place in the room where the reloading took place and included the metal gun cabinet as part of that scene. There is no evidence of electrical failure or electrical arcing, so that eliminates that as a potential cause of the blast. Over on page 13, an investigator noted that ATF literature details the dangers of seating primers close to where you have a lot of gunpowder, which I would hope every reloader would agree with. Another interesting bit is at the next paragraph, where that same investigator notes that the 6 empty canisters of gunpowder found in the back patio, which were IMR 3031 and IMR 4064, had been filled with powders that could be used to reload .223 Remington. He also noted that manufacturers warned against mixing different kinds of powders for reloading, leading me to believe that the ATF believes that the reloader had blended those two types of gunpowder so that he could reload .223 Remington Together, and ostensibly, that totals the 6 pounds. Now, if he did that with 18 years of experience reloading, that is one of those cautionary lessons about not assuming anyone is an expert just because they haven't blown themselves up after decades of reloading. Okay, that exciting info dump concluded. What does the ATF think actually happened? Well, here are the primary conclusions, at least 3 of them which are most directly pertinent to this video. Number 1, the explosion took place in the room where the reloading took place. 2, they couldn't rule out that an open flame around the gunpowder didn't cause the explosion. That is, the reloader could have been smoking while running that Dillon, or he was in the process of lighting a cigarette. 3, the stuck primer in the reloading press was the other potential explanation, detonating during the reloading process and igniting the can of gunpowder a few inches away, which then set off the gunpowder in the gun cabinet. The powder that the ATF noted was removed from its original containers, those 6 empty cans that they found on the patio. Now, regardless of whether it was, the ignition source was a flame or primer detonation, the ATF ruled the explosion was in fact an accident. So how does this report and its conclusions jibe with the arguments that I made in my original video last October? Well, I would argue that where I was wrong was predicated on the assumptions based on how I reload. My arguments in that video assumed that the smokeless gunpowder was in its original containers, ones that I believe are impossible to build up the necessary pressure in to cause an explosion. I also assumed that the explosion was limited to a single canister on the bench, and also that no one would actually smoke in the same room that reloading takes place, let alone doing so while actually reloading. That's because I leave powder in the original container and I don't smoke anywhere near I reload. I also argued that I didn't believe that smokeless gunpowder, which technically is an explosive, would cause such a massive explosion if ignited. I argued in that video that unlike explosives, which generally convert their mass to energy, almost instantaneously, smokeless gunpowder burns at a quick but controlled rate, releasing its energy slowly relative to an explosive. I also hadn't assumed that up to 7 pounds of gunpowder was involved. 1 pound in the canister next to the press, the other 6 in the nearby cabinet. However, all bets are off when a confluence of factors come together. We can assume that the 6 individual pounds of gunpowder from the containers found on the patio were probably blended together into a single container. We know that 6 pounds was in the gun cabinet in the reloading room. What we don't know, because I couldn't tease it out of the report, was what kind of container was it in? Metal, plastic, other, a bowl, who knows? A closed metal container could raise that pressure quickly, since the burning powder would presumably have a little place to vent, though I'm not entirely sure how it would have ignited in what was a fast chain reaction explosion. We also don't know whether the gun cabinet door was actually closed or open. I'm assuming open. Closed, it would potentially increase that pressure even further. I would say it was probably open only because I don't see how that flame would have ignited the powder inside otherwise. Also, adding to the potential of this happening was the state of the room to begin with. A lot of reloaders brag about never cleaning up their reloading bench. Was the reloader's bench area covered in gunpowder and its dust? Was the air filled with that same kind of gunpowder dust which promotes fire from one container to the cabinet? Not even the ATF can determine that thing ex post facto. So whether it was a stuck primer that ignited or a cigarette that was lit is irrelevant. All that was potentially needed was an igniter. So I was wrong in my strongly worded argument that gunpowder couldn't level home and render it a total write-off. But that was based on a series of assumptions that someone who doesn't do dangerous things would have. My mistake was not thinking like someone who apparently disregards common sense. So what can we actually take away from all of this? While I do wish that the report from the ATF was a little more unequivocal, they attribute the explosion to either a primer detonating or an ignition source like a lighter, which then started off a chain reaction that resulted in a home being destroyed. Is 6 or 7 pounds of smokeless powder enough to do that? Short of testing it out myself, which, with the cost of powder these days, would be a pricey endeavor, not to mention attract the attention of authorities here, I suppose we're going to have to accept the ATF's conclusion that it is. We can also remind ourselves of some simple and common sense reloading safety measures. Leave your gunpowder in the original containers they came in, whether they were designed to give way quickly in a fire or it's just an unexpected benefit from their design. It's probably safer to do that than to pour several pounds of gunpowder in a container that wasn't designed to hold gunpowder that might then build up the necessary pressure to explode in a fire. Don't mix different kinds of gunpowder together. I know that's not a contributory cause to this explosion, but I also know it's a stupid thing to do for various reasons. In this case, we know what IMR 3031 and IMR 4064 do individually when it comes to loads, but I don't think there's a lot of us that know what some unknown mix of the two are in fact capable of. Don't smoke cigarettes or anything else in your reloading room. That's so obvious, I'm kind of even disappointed that it needs to be mentioned. Keep your reloading room clean. I've seen some pigsties masquerading as reloading benches, and I always wonder when the boom is going to happen. Have a vacuum or a wet vac in the room and regularly clean your space. Change the filter bag in that vacuum regularly. Open a window occasionally and clear the air in there. Keep your space as free from clutter as possible. Store your gunpowder in a safe manner. You can find all sorts of plans online on containers ideally suited for gunpowder storage, and they're usually pretty easy to put together. Keep that container separate from your reloading space. Keep cans of gunpowder you're actually using during a reloading session away from your press, particularly if you're priming. And speaking of presses, there are a lot of knuckleheads out there who think a progressive press is licensed to churn out ammo as quickly as possible without regard for reloading as a deliberate process. As great as a progressive press is, it too suffers from occasional failure. A progressive press is designed to allow you to complete several steps at once. It's not meant for you to pull the handle like a granny feeding nickels into a Vegas slot machine. Anyway, I think we can put this to bed. An accidental explosion occurred due to a series of decisions and events, as they often are, and 2 people were seriously hurt as well as their home being destroyed. I hope both are doing better today. If the accident has shown us anything, it's not to be sanguine about reloading. It is a safe hobby, but like many hobbies, it does carry some risk. You can mitigate that risk by following some pretty common sense rules. Don't be that guy who walks into a gun store and proclaims, "I've been reloading for X years and I didn't think that this would happen to me." Well, it did to at least one guy. At any rate, I hope you find today's video to be mildly entertaining and vaguely informative, if only to compensate me for having to read dry ATF reports. As always, may all of your reloading be safe and produce excellent results. Take care, and bye-bye.